The gardener. The smell was the first thing that reached Detective Tom Miller. Not the smell of decay, as one might expect, but something sweet and wrong, like overripe fruit sprayed with cheap perfume. He stepped through the makeshift barrier the uniformed officers had erected around the tidy single-family home in one of Bridgeport, Connecticut's nicer suburbs. The crime scene was, as they often are, a study in contrasts. Outside, a perfect facade of carefully trimmed lawn and rose beds that seemed to glow in the late summer heat. Inside, a nightmare. "Miller, glad you could make it," growled Captain Davies, his face weathered by years of service and an unhealthy dose of coffee and cigar consumption. "You said you wanted something to do. Well, here you go." Tom just nodded, his eyes already scanning the room. The victim, Richie Finch, a real estate agent in his mid-50s, lay on the living room floor. Not that you could immediately identify him as a person. He had been carefully arranged, covered in soil taken from one of the garden beds. Small, delicate seedlings were sprouting from the carpet, an absurd, macabre work of art. Finch's hands were bound, but not with ropes or zip ties, but with the stems of climbing roses, their thorns digging deep into his skin. His mouth was stuffed with a blooming lily. "Cause of death?" Tom asked softly, kneeling to get a closer look at the soil. It wasn't just regular garden soil. He sniffed it. Compost, but also something else, something rotten. "The coroner isn't entirely sure yet, but it seems to be suffocation," Davies replied. "The lily blocked his airways, and the wounds on his hands, he inflicted those himself trying to tear the stems apart. This wasn't a quick death, Miller." Tom remained silent. He'd known Davies long enough to know that the captain wasn't speaking out of morbid sensationalism, but from a deep-seated wariness of the depths of the human soul. He stood up again and looked around the room. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, just the stench of overwhelming, grotesque beauty. The windows were open, a light breeze swaying the curtains. It seemed the perpetrator had arranged everything calmly, without haste, without fear of being disturbed. Did the neighbors hear anything, see anything? Nothing. Finch was a widower, lived alone, had no children. He wasn't particularly popular with the neighbors, but not unpopular either. A typical, respectable man who loved his garden above all else, Davy said. It was his only hobby, I guess. Ironic, right? Tom ignored the remark. He went into the kitchen, assuming he would find more clues there. A half-full coffee cup lay on the kitchen table, a newspaper beside it. So the killer must have been there at the same time as Finch, without a struggle. He must have known Finch, or Finch was so trusting that he opened the door for him. In the sink was a bucket. Inside were tools, not usual kitchen utensils, but a pair of pruning shears, a small trowel, and a pair of dirty gardening gloves. Everything had been neatly washed, except for a small dark stain on the inside of one glove, which immediately caught Tom's eye. He carefully placed it in an evidence bag. When he returned to the living room, he looked at the macabre arrangement again. The lily, the rose, the soil. They hadn't been chosen at random. They were part of a message. The gardener has planted his first seed. What was that, Miller? Nothing, Captain. Just that I have a feeling we're not looking for a killer here, but for a gardener. Someone who treats plants and people in the same perverse way. Tom stepped outside and looked at the manicured street. One flawless lawn after another. Every gardener has their own philosophy. A gardener pays attention to every detail, knows their plants. A gardener observes. Somewhere out there, among these neat hedges and blooming bushes, the killer lived. A quiet, methodical man who saw himself as a guardian of order. A man who believed he had the right to decide over life and death. And he had only just begun. Tom drove his old, beat-up Ford along the country road that wound through the autumnal Connecticut landscape. The trees were already a vibrant spectacle of red, orange, and yellow, a stark contrast to the darkness awaiting him in the city. He was on his way to see Dr. Eleanor Vance, a forensic scientist and good friend whose expertise in biology and botany would be essential for this case. Her lab smelled of formaldehyde and coffee. Dr. Vance, a slender woman with a sharp gaze behind her glasses, was already waiting for him. On a steel table, the evidence lay in plastic bags, carefully labeled: the pruning shears, the gloves, and a glass container with the soil from the crime scene. "I've looked at the material, Tom," she began, getting straight to the point. "The soil, as you suspected, isn't normal compost. It contains traces of human remains, bone meal to be precise. It's a practice some gardeners use to fertilize the soil. Very macabre, but not illegal if the source of the bones is legal." Tom frowned. "You're saying the source is legal? Please explain." "The compost came from a crematorium," Dr. Vance explained calmly. "The ashes you found in the soil are human ashes, mixed with crushed bone fragments. They were processed professionally. The gardener didn't just get his ingredients from anywhere, Tom. He bought them." Tom understood. The killer wasn't just a murderer. He was methodical and precise in his insane logic. He had obtained the ingredients for his act from an official supplier. The trail led to a nearby crematorium. "I have something else," Eleanor continued, pointing to the pruning shears. "I found DNA traces on the blade, not from the victim, but from the perpetrator. And there was a small red fiber on the glove. I analyzed it. It came from a specific type of climbing plant that is rarely found in this area." Tom felt a picture beginning to form in his mind. The killer had a plan, a pattern. He wasn't a chaotic murderer, but an artist, a gardener who treated people like his plants. "The plant, the 7-star yew," Eleanor read from her screen, "extremely rare. It's only cultivated in a few nurseries. The fiber could have come from the plant stem when he cut it." Tom jotted down the name of the nursery Eleanor had found. It was a long list, but they finally had a lead. The hunt had begun. 2 days later, while the city was still asleep, a second victim was found. This time in a park near a small pond surrounded by carefully arranged flower beds. The victim, a retired teacher named Helen Peterson, was sitting on a bench, her head resting in a basket full of daisies. Her hands were bound, not with thorns, but with thick, soft grasses that gently wrapped around her. The sweet, wrong smell of death was back. She had been killed by drowning, but the real message was the staging. Tom noticed that daisies were also known as Daisy, a play on her first name. The killer had not only taken his victim's life, but had also integrated their identity into his perverse art. The body was like a seed planted in the city's garden. The police found no other traces, no DNA, no fingerprints, but they did find a note in the victim's jacket pocket. It wasn't a suicide note, but a handwritten botanical drawing of a plant that Tom immediately recognized: the 7-star yew. Below the drawing, a single word was scrawled: flourish. The hunt for the gardener had begun, and he seemed determined to continue sowing the seeds of his cruelty. The list of nurseries that carried the rare 7-star yew was pinned to the wall at police headquarters. There were 13 in total, all within a 200-kilometer radius of Bridgeport. Tom divided his team, assigning each a certain number of nurseries. He took on the smaller, family-run ones nearby, guessing they would have a soft spot for special plants. His first stop was a small greenhouse near a lake. An older man named Walter Gorski, with bony hands and a sun-beaten face, greeted him with a smile. He wore dirty overalls and smelled of soil and freshly mown grass. "The 7-star yew? Yes, I have it," Gorski said in a soft, raspy voice. "A very demanding plant, needs a lot of care and patience, but once it grows, it's beautiful." Tom looked around. The greenhouse was immaculate. Every plant was in its place, the soil in the pots was moist but not wet. Everything seemed perfect. Too perfect. "We sold one to a man a few months ago," Gorski continued. "A gardener. He seemed very keen on cultivating the plant. He even told me some of his ideas." "What ideas?" Tom asked, his inner tension growing. "He talked about the 7 sins," Gorski said quietly. "He said the yew was like sin. it grows, blossoms, and eventually bears fruit that can lead to death. I thought it was just gardener's philosophy. Some of us get a little peculiar with age. Tom looked Gorski in the eyes. What did this man look like? He was around 40, slender, with neat dark hair, Gorski described. He wore a hat. He was very polite, very reserved. The description didn't match anyone the police had as a suspect, but the mention of the 7 sins was a jolt, another clue that reinforced the macabre staging. The killer wasn't just a gardener, but a theologian of death. Tom and his team spent the next few days canvassing the other nurseries, but there were no other leads, no other sales of the 7-star U. A week later, the third victim was found, this time in an abandoned quarry outside the city. The victim was a well-known judge, Arthur Caldwell. He sat in an old wheelchair, carefully placed on a rock. His eyes were wide open, gazing at the sky. His hands weren't bound, but his mouth was wide open, stuffed with glittering gemstones. A delicate fern grew around his head, planted in the crevices of the wheelchair and the rock, a picture of greed that Tom immediately recognized. A note was pinned to his chest with the word flourish, and below it, a new name, a fourth name, the fourth victim. It was a young man named Michael Davies, who worked as a night watchman at a shopping center. Time was running out. The gardener had a new target. Tom and his team raced to the shopping center where Michael Davies worked. It was a huge, faceless concrete block, lying like a sleeping behemoth on the edge of the city. Sirens wailed in the darkness, and blue lights flickered across the smooth facade. Davies, an unassuming man in his early 20s who lived a minimalist life, was scheduled to be on watch in the computer department that night. The door to the department had been broken open, but not by force. The killer had picked the lock, much like a gardener opening a door to a new room in his garden. Inside, amidst the shelves of laptops, consoles, and smartphones, it was cold, silent, and eerie. Davies's body was tied to a wall covered with a series of cables and wires. He was wrapped from head to toe in dried grapes, dates, and figs, which stuck to his body like a second skin. In his right hand, he held a small, shiny apple. On his chest was a hand-drawn symbol, a depiction of a rose with a cross in the middle, a symbol that could point to a secret organization known as the Rosicrucians. The rose stood for the blood of Christ, the cross for his death. The sin of gluttony was being staged here. The food wasn't chosen at random, it was a symbol of wealth and abundance. But that was only half the truth. In the forensics lab, Dr. Vance discovered that the dried fruits had been treated with a tiny dose of a potent tranquilizer. The killer had slowly paralyzed Davies before killing him. The cause of death was drowning, but not in water, in his own vomit. A cruel, heinous parody of gluttony. The rose with the cross, the greed, the gluttony, the gardening, it all seemed to fit together. The killer wasn't just a murderer, he was an artist of the absurd. He had a plan, he was following a pattern, and the city was his garden. Tom drove back to headquarters, his mind racing. He called Dr. Vance. "Eleanor, I need a list of all the employees who have worked at the nurseries where the 7-star U was sold. Anyone who has any connection to the gardening business." "Should I also cross-reference the lists of employees at the crematoriums?" she asked. "Yes, do that, and check the lists of judges, real estate agents, and night watchmen who have retired or been laid off in recent years. I want to know if there's a connection between the victims and the gardener." The next morning, Eleanor had the lists ready for Tom. He sat down at the table with a cup of coffee and began to read the names. There was one name that immediately caught his eye, a name that appeared on all the lists. A gardener who had worked at one of the nurseries in the 90s, a former employee of the crematorium, and a night watchman at a shopping center where the judge and the real estate agent were also clients. The name was David Garrow. Tom felt his fist clench. He had a hunch. It wasn't Garrow, but he was the key.
Gero was the assistant to a gardener who had a history of mental health issues in recent years. His name was Jonathan Weaver. Tom called the team together. They had a new plan. They would observe Weaver and Gero until they made a mistake, and then they would strike. They knew the gardener wouldn't abandon his seeds. He would continue, but they were ready. They were ready for the next step.
Tom took one last look at the file for Jonathan Weaver, the gardener. 50 years old, single, no children. He lived in a small, secluded cabin on the edge of a large forest. Weaver had a past that had made him a loner. His wife and small daughter had died in a car accident 10 years ago. After that, he had completely withdrawn and dedicated his life to gardening. With this new information, Tom drove straight to Weaver's cabin. The garden was a true work of art. Every flower, every bush seemed carefully placed. Roses grew up the wall, and trees cast long shadows on the lawn. In the middle of the garden stood a sculpture of old wood, depicting a man holding a head in his hands, a morbid decoration that immediately put Tom on high alert. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. Peering through the window, he saw a collection of photos in the living room. Pictures of Weaver and his family, his wife and daughter. But there was another collection that sent a chill down Tom's spine. Newspaper clippings of all the victims he had found so far. The door was unlocked. He stepped inside and looked around. Everything was neat and clean. In the kitchen, there was a cup of cold coffee, and on the table, an open book on botany. Underneath the book was a map of Bridgeport and the surrounding area. All the crime scenes were marked with red pins, forming an irregular circle. In the middle of this circle, at an unmarked spot, was a small symbol, a rose with a cross in the center. Tom knew the symbol. It was the sign of the Rosicrucians, a mystical secret society. But here, in this macabre context, it was a message. It was the last sin, the sin of sloth. The fourth victim, Michael Davies, had been staged by Weaver with the fruits of gluttony. But on the map, Weaver had marked a new sin, sloth. Tom called Captain Davies. "We have him, Captain. Jonathan Weaver. He's the gardener. But he's not here. He left us a message." "What message?" Davies asked. "He's revealed the next crime scene. He's announced sloth. I need the whole team here, Captain. I think we need to be fast." The police stormed Weaver's cabin, but the gardener was already gone. They found further evidence that unequivocally proved Weaver's guilt, DNA traces that matched the gloves and the pruning shears, and a diary that detailed the planning of every single murder. The last entry read, "The soil is prepared. The seeds are planted. Now it is time for the final harvest." Tom felt a shiver run down his spine. The gardener had committed the fourth sin. He was now looking for a new victim, a victim who embodies the sin of sloth. And Tom knew he had to find them before the gardener did. But where? Tom sat in the office, staring at the map he'd brought back from Weaver's cabin. The irregular circle, the red markings of the crime scenes, the Rosicrucian symbol in the middle, it was a puzzle he was trying to solve. The gardener had announced the sin of sloth as his next act, but where was the victim? Investigators had searched Weaver's cabin, but only found the diary and the map. Weaver's fingerprints were on the cups, on the doors, on the books. They were everywhere. The gardener hadn't been in a hurry to cover his tracks because he knew he was one step ahead of them. Tom called Dr. Vance to update her. "Eleonora, I need a list of all Bridgeport residents who have been flagged in recent years for chronic illness, laziness, or unemployment. We have to find the next victim before Weaver does." Eleanor was stunned. "Tom, that's an impractical request. Privacy regulations." "I know, Eleanor," Tom said, his voice full of despair, "but we don't have time. Weaver left us a new message, the Rosicrucian symbol. He drew it on the map. I think it's a hint for the fifth sin, wrath." "Wrath?" Eleanor asked. "Yes," Tom said. "The gardener hasn't just announced his next steps. He's also drawn us into his game. He wants us to follow him, to follow his clues. He's angry with the world and wants to show us his wrath." The search for the fifth victim, who symbolized the sin of sloth, led investigators to a secluded motel on the outskirts of the city. There, in a small room that smelled of old sweat and cheap cigarette smoke, they found the fifth victim. She was a young woman, a prostitute named Maria Sanchez. She was dead, but not from violence. She had suffocated on her own vomit. In her hand, she held a bouquet of wilted lilies. The lilies were a symbol of the purity she never had. Tom looked around the room. The walls were bare, the furniture was old and worn. The woman had no friends, no family, no one to look for her. She was the perfect embodiment of sloth. She had done nothing to escape her fate. She had only lived to die. Tom felt a weave of anger surge through his body. He stared at the dead woman and felt Weaver's gaze on the back of his neck. He knew Weaver wasn't committing the murders because he was a monster, but because he had a message he was conveying to them in the language of nature, botany, and sin. Tom turned around and saw a map on the nightstand. The map was identical to the one he had found in Weaver's cabin. Only this time, sloth was marked, and a new sin was announced: wrath. The gardener wasn't finished yet. He was ready for his next harvest, and Tom knew he had to find him before it was too late. The team, exhausted and demoralized, sat at headquarters. The map lay on the table. 5 red markings formed an incomplete circle. The last one, Maria Sanchez's motel room, had the new Rosicrucian symbol. It was the sign for wrath, the 6th sin. Tom felt like he was fumbling in the dark. Weaver was playing a game with them, and he was always one step ahead. Every time they thought they had him, he had already disappeared and sown a new seed. Eleanor Vance entered the office, holding a tablet. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep. "I pulled out all the stops, Tom. I've scoured the data of all Bridgeport citizens. I have a list of people who have been flagged in recent years for aggressive behavior, domestic violence, or other violent crimes." Tom looked at her. "How many?" "Over 100, Eleanor replied, "but I've narrowed the list. I looked for people who were flagged in the last 10 years, since the death of Weaver's family, and I looked for people who had a connection to nurseries or to Weaver's circle." Eleanor showed him a list of 3 names. The first name was a former colleague of Weaver's from the nursery. He had been fired for aggravated assault and vandalism. The second name was a former client of Weaver's, a retired teacher who became mentally unstable after his wife's death and was known for being hot-tempered. And the third name was a neighbor of Weaver's cabin, a man named Frank Carlson, who repeatedly got into arguments with Weaver. Tom felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had a bad feeling. Carlson, what do we know about him? Eleanor wiped from her tablet. Frank Carlson, 65, retired construction worker, lives alone. In recent years, he has repeatedly destroyed Weaver's plants and insulted him because he didn't like his garden. Tom knew instantly that he had to find Carlson. He had a feeling this man was the next victim. He had a feeling the gardener would direct his wrath at this man, who had so angered him in the past. Tom and his team drove to Carlson's house. It was a small, dilapidated building with a neglected garden. Weeds grew everywhere, and the flower beds were empty. The windows were boarded up. Tom knocked on the door, but no one answered. He pushed a board off a window and looked inside. The house was dark, but he could make out a figure on the floor. It was Carlson. He was lying on the floor, his face blue, his mouth wide open, filled with soil and stones. A thin layer of ash was scattered around his body. This was the wrath that Weaver had announced. It was the last sign. Tom bent down and saw a handwritten word on the floor next to Carlson's body, written in the dirt. It was the word gardener. Tom knew that Weaver had left him a message. He had told him that he was the gardener, and he had told him that he was coming for him now. Tom stood up and looked at the map he had left at headquarters. He knew that Weaver would mark the next symbol, the final sin, the sin of envy. But he didn't know where, and he knew he had to figure it out before the gardener harvested his final crop. Tom stood outside Frank Carlson's house, where the man's body lay still in the earth, dusted with human ashes. Wrath had been executed, and Weaver had left another message: gardener. Back at headquarters, surveillance tapes from Carlson's house were analyzed. They showed a man in a hat and gardening clothes moving discreetly in the darkness. He had calmly broken down the door, committed his act, and left the house without a trace, except for his message. Tom looked at the map, on which the 6 red markings formed a circle. In the center of the circle, at a spot Tom knew intuitively, was the symbol for envy. It was the 7th and final sin Weaver was announcing. Tom stared at the map. The circle was almost complete. Only one sin remained. Envy, the mother of all sins, as some called it. He knew that Weaver was now going to end his game. Eleanor Vance, the forensic scientist, entered the office. She was exhausted, but her gaze was clear. "I've scoured the lists, Tom. I've been looking for people who have been flagged for envy or jealousy in recent years, and I've only found one name that fits Weaver's profile. A young man named Dennis Finch, a neighbor of Richie Finch, the first victim, and a gardener." Tom felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He remembered Richie Finch, the real estate agent who loved his garden above all else. And he remembered Captain Davies' statement that Finch was not particularly popular with his neighbors. Finch loved his garden, Tom said quietly. He was proud of it. And Weaver hated it. He envied Finch. But Dennis Finch, he was the neighbor. What did he have to do with Weaver? Eleanor read from her tablet. Dennis Finch was a gardener. He worked at the same nursery as Weaver, and he envied him. He admired him and at the same time hated him because, in his opinion, Weaver was more talented. Tom felt a picture forming in his mind. Weaver was not the killer. He was the mastermind. He had manipulated Dennis Finch, a young, unstable man, and incited him to commit the murders. Dennis Finch was the gardener. He was the murderer. He was the envy. Tom jumped up. "Eleanor, I need Dennis Finch's address, and I need the whole team. I think we've found our murderer, and we have to find him before he harvests his final crop." They raced to Dennis Finch's apartment. The door was open, the apartment was empty, but on the table lay a map, the same map that Weaver had used. Only this time, the 7th sin was marked. And it wasn't marked, it was just drawn as an empty field in the center of the circle. Tom felt a shiver run down his spine. The empty field was the gardener's last hiding place, the final sin. He had solved the puzzle. He had found the murderer. But where was he? And who was the 7th sin? Tom felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The empty field on the map, right in the center of the circle of murders, it wasn't just an empty space. It was a symbol. The symbol for envy, the 7th and final sin that Weaver had yet to stage. He was sure that Dennis Finch had committed the murders under Weaver's guidance. But where was Dennis now? And what was the significance of the empty field on the map? Eleanor Vance, who was still standing beside him, looked at the map with concern. The empty field, Tom, it's not just an empty space. It's a lake, Blackwood Lake. Tom looked at the map and recognized it immediately. The lake was near Weaver's cabin, the place where Weaver had lost his wife and daughter, the place where his life had taken a tragic turn. "That's it, Eleanor," Tom said, his voice trembling with tension. "Dennis Finch isn't the gardener. He's the seed. Weaver manipulated him and drove him to madness. But Weaver, he is the true gardener. He committed the murders to get revenge, but he also involved us in his game. He lured us into his garden." They raced to Blackwood Lake. The moon was bright, casting long shadows on the water. On the shore stood a small abandoned houseboat. In front of it was a gardener, tinkering with soil and tools. It was Jonathan Weaver. He looked old and tired, but his eyes sparkled with madness. In his hands, he held a shovel and was digging a hole. In the hole lay a small wooden coffin. It was his daughter's coffin. He wanted to bury her, and he wanted to prepare a grave for her that symbolized the 7th sin, envy. "Weaver!" Tom shouted as he jumped out of the car. "Stop that! Give up!" Weaver looked at him, his eyes empty. "I am not the murderer, detective," he said. "I am the gardener. I just planted the seeds. I staged the sin that has afflicted humanity. I showed them the sins they carry within themselves. Tom looked around. He saw the other investigators approaching Weaver with their guns drawn. But Weaver didn't hesitate. He took a small bottle from his pocket and drank the contents. It was poison. "The seventh sin," Weaver said as he fell to the ground, "the true sin is envy. The envy that people carry within them. The envy that turns them into monsters." Tom and his team arrived too late. Weaver was dead. But his message wasn't over yet. In the middle of the coffin he was burying, there was a note. On the note was only one word: flourish. And on the back, a name: Tom Miller. Tom knew that Weaver had left him one final message. He had made him part of his garden, and he had told him that the true sin wasn't the envy of others, but his own envy. The envy that had driven him to find the killer. The envy that had turned him into a hunter. And now he was the hunted.
Tom held the note in his trembling hand. The name? Tom Miller. It wasn't an end, but the beginning of a new personal hell. Weaver had chosen him not just as the hunter, but as the next seed in his grotesque garden. The last symbol, the empty field on the map, wasn't just his daughter's grave. It was Tom's future resting place. He was the seventh sin, envy. Weaver had been watching him, his insatiable eagerness to solve the case, his desperation with each new victim. 3 weeks after Weaver's death, the world was quiet. The city of Bridgeport breathed a sigh of relief, believing the nightmare was over. But for Tom, it had just begun. The smell of the earth that had haunted him at the crime scenes now seemed to emanate from his own pores. He looked at his family, his wife and son, and wondered if he was worth it. If his envy, which drove him to be the best detective, had put them in danger. One evening, as he sat in the kitchen with his wife, he noticed something in his garden, a small, delicate seedling. He went outside to get a closer look. It was a 7-star U, the symbol of sin he had searched for in every nursery. And it was in his own garden. Tom felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had a suspicion, but he didn't want to believe it. He rushed into the garage and found a small container in a toolbox. Inside was the poison Weaver had taken, and on it was a note. A handwritten word that Tom knew: flourish. Tom raced back to Blackwood Lake. He had to know if Weaver was really dead. The police had recovered Weaver's body, but Tom knew the gardener was a master of deception. At the lakeshore, he found his daughter's grave. The coffin was still there, but inside the coffin was not the girl's body. It was a dummy, filled with dirt. Tom's heart sank. Weaver wasn't dead. He had faked his own death to mislead the police. He had only taken the poison to make them believe he was dead. Tom raced back to headquarters. He had to find the map Weaver had left him. He had to know where the seventh sin, envy, was taking place. And he had to know where Weaver was. He found the map in his office. The empty field was no longer empty. It was marked with a small symbol, a small arrow pointing to a place outside the city, a place where a cemetery was located. And in the middle of the cemetery was a small chapel. Tom felt his stomach clench. He knew Weaver was waiting for him, and he knew he was walking into a trap. But he had no choice. He had to find the gardener before he harvested his final crop, the final sin, the sin of envy. And he knew that he was the final sin. The story is not yet over. It remains to be seen whether Tom can catch the gardener or if he will become the next victim.
Tom sped toward the cemetery, his thoughts racing. So Weaver wasn't dead. He had faked his own death to deceive him and lure him to his final stage. The cemetery, the place where life and death meet, was the perfect setting for the final sin, envy. As he passed through the cemetery gates, he saw the small chapel in the distance. A single beam of light shone from a window like a spotlight on a stage, waiting for its lead actor. Tom got out of his car, his hand on the grip of his service weapon. The night was cold, the wind whispering through the old trees, carrying with it the secrets of the dead. He walked slowly toward the chapel. The door was slightly ajar. He stepped inside, gun in hand. The chapel was small, the air smelling of old wood and burnt candles. In the middle of the room stood an altar. On it lay a map, the same map he had found in Weaver's cabin. And on the map, right in the center, was a marking. It wasn't red like the others, but green, a small green dot. Tom leaned over the map and recognized the symbol immediately. It was the symbol for hope. Weaver had staged the sins to terrify people, but he had also left them a glimmer of hope. The hope that they could free themselves from their sins. The hope that there was a way out of the darkness. A voice emerged from the shadows of the chapel. "Detective Miller, I've been expecting you." It was Weaver. He stepped out of the shadows, his face etched with the scars of the past. He wore an old, oversized gray suit. In his hand, he held blood-stained pruning shears. The true sin, detective, is not greed, envy, or lust. The true sin is the lack of hope, the lack of faith in the good in people. And I've shown you that there is always hope, the hope that people can recognize their sins and change. Tom pointed his gun at Weaver. "Where is he, Weaver? Where is Dennis Finch?" Weaver smiled, his eyes gleaming with madness. "Dennis? He is the final sin, detective. He is the envy. He committed the murders. I just showed him how to do it." Tom felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had been wrong. He had believed Weaver was the killer, but Weaver was just the gardener, the man who planted the seeds of hatred in people's minds. "And now, detective," Weaver continued, "it's time to write the final chapter. It's time to bury hope." He raised his pruning shears. Tom knew he had to stop him. But Weaver wasn't alone. Other figures emerged from the shadows. They were masked, their faces hidden. They carried pruning shears, spades, and other tools. They were Weaver's gardeners. Tom's heart clenched in his chest. He was trapped. He was caught in the gardener's trap. He was the final victim. He was hope. And Weaver was ready to bury hope. Tom stared into the gardener's dark eyes, realizing Jonathan Weaver wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the chapel's shadows, their faces hidden behind old straw hats. Wearing gardening gloves, they held tools like spades and rakes. Weaver wasn't just a murderer. He was the leader of a cult. His philosophy of sin and hope had found disciples. "So you are the final seed, Detective Miller," Weaver said, in a soft, almost loving voice. "The symbol of the envy that drove you to hunt us. And now, in this chapel where heaven and earth touch, it is time for the final harvest." Tom knew he was trapped. A bullet wouldn't help here. He was surrounded. He lowered his weapon and raised his hands, trying to buy time. "What do you want, Weaver? You staged these murders to punish people. But what about me? I'm just the detective." Weaver smiled. "Exactly. You're just the detective. You were so determined to catch us, expose us, punish us. You envied us because we had a plan, and you didn't. You admired us because we had our own order, and you didn't. Envy, detective, is the sin that has afflicted you most. And now it is time to cut that sin from your soul." The gardeners began to move slowly, approaching Tom. Their faces were hidden behind their straw hats, but Tom felt their stares. It was a ritual, not an execution. They didn't want to simply kill him. They wanted to plant him in their garden. Suddenly, a beam of light shot through the chapel window and hit Weaver's face. A shot echoed through the chapel. Weaver staggered back, a red flower blossoming on his chest. He looked at Tom, his eyes wide. "Hope," he whispered, before collapsing to the ground. A second shot rang out. One of the gardeners fell, then a third, a fourth. The gardeners scattered in a panic, the chapel filling with the sound of running and fear. Tom looked toward the door. Dr. Eleanor Vance stood there, holding a small gun. She had understood the message on the map and had followed him. She had saved hope. Tom and Eleanor stood in the chapel, surrounded by the dead and injured gardeners. They looked at Weaver, who was on the ground. He wasn't dead, just wounded. He was breathing heavily, but his eyes still flickered. "You've saved hope, Detective," he said, "but you haven't destroyed the seed. The seeds are in people's minds, and they will continue to grow." Tom looked at him. "What about Dennis Finch?" he asked. "Where is he?" Weaver smiled, his face smeared with blood. "Dennis, he has a new identity. He is now one of the gardeners. He is the hope that continues to grow. And you, Detective, are the hunter. But you will never find him. He is everywhere. He is the next sin, the next flower that blooms in your garden." Tom felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Weaver was right. Dennis Finch wasn't the murderer. He was the symbol of envy. And he was out there somewhere, ready to commit the next sin. And Tom, the hunter, had fallen into a new, much deeper trap. The trap of the unknown. Tom, Eleanor, and the arriving police secured the chapel. Weaver was taken away, bleeding but alive. His followers, who had fled in a panic, were later caught in the surrounding woods. But there was no trace of Dennis Finch, the man Weaver had called the personification of the sin of envy. Tom stared at the map he had found on the altar. The symbol of hope wasn't the end, but a brutal, ironic deception. Weaver had staged hope to lure him into a trap. Now, with the gardener in prison, Tom was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted. He was the one Weaver had chosen as the final victim. In the following weeks, Weaver was interrogated, but he remained silent. He only spoke in riddles, in parables about gardeners, seeds, and harvests. He revealed nothing about Dennis Finch or the identity of the other followers. Tom had the feeling that Weaver was still pulling the strings, even from behind bars. One evening, when he came home, he saw a small brown envelope in his mailbox. He opened it and found a seed inside. It was a 7-star U seed, the same one that had grown in his garden. And on the back of the envelope was a name: Dennis Finch. Tom felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Finch wasn't just a murderer. He was a part of Weaver. He was the sin that continued to grow, even after the gardener was behind bars. Tom called Eleanor. "Eleanor, I need a list of all the gardeners in the city who have changed their identity in recent years. I also need a list of all the people who have worked in nurseries or in agriculture in recent years and have taken on a new identity." Eleanor was stunned. "Tom, that's an almost impossible request. There are hundreds of gardeners who could change their identity." "I know, Eleanor," Tom said, his voice trembling with desperation, "but I have to do it. I have to find him. I have to bury the hope that Weaver planted in him." The search for Dennis Finch was long and tedious. Tom spent weeks sifting through old files, questioning witnesses, and checking every gardener in the city. He found nothing. Finch was like a ghost, wandering through the city, invisible and untraceable. One evening, as he sat in the office, an old photo he had found in Weaver's cabin caught his eye. It was a photo of Weaver, his wife, and his daughter. But behind them, another man could be smiling, his eyes full of admiration for Weaver. It was Dennis Finch, and he wasn't alone. Next to him stood a young woman who was smiling. She was holding a flower. The flower was a symbol of purity. She was the first sin. And on the back of the photo was a name: Maria Finch, the sister of Dennis Finch, the woman who, as a prostitute, had personified the sin of sloth. Tom felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had been wrong. He had believed Weaver was the mastermind, but Weaver was just the gardener, the man who planted the seeds of hatred in people's minds. But Dennis and Maria Finch were the real murderers. The hope that Weaver had planted in people's minds was the hope of revenge. And now, they were ready to commit the next sin. And Tom was their next target. Tom held the old photograph in his hand. The realization was a gut punch. Weaver wasn't the gardener. He was the prophet. He had planted the seeds of hatred in the hearts of the Finch siblings, and they were the executors, the true murderers. Dennis and Maria Finch, a sibling pair, unassuming and invisible, driven by an envy that had turned them into monsters. He looked at the back of the photo, where it read Maria Finch, sloth. She was the woman found in the motel room, a prostitute. But she wasn't the victim, she was the perpetrator. She had faked her own death to mislead the police. But why? The answer came from another old photograph he found at Weaver's house. It was a picture of Maria Finch, smiling and holding a flower that Tom recognized instantly, a lily, the symbol of purity. Maria had killed the first victim, Richie Finch, with a lily, and she had staged her own death to lead the police astray. Tom understood the perversion of Weaver's plan. He had used the Finch siblings to spread his ideology. They were the seeds growing in his garden of sins, and he, Tom, was the hunter, driven by the fear and envy of finding them. The following weeks were a nightmare. The search for Dennis and Maria Finch was long and fruitless. They were ghosts, haunting the city, adapting to every place. Tom couldn't sleep, haunted by the feeling that they were watching him, luring him into their garden. One day, as he sat in his office, his phone rang. It was Eleanor. Her voice was filled with panic. "Tom, I found something. The Finch siblings' records. They were reported missing a month ago, and the woman we thought was Maria Finch, it wasn't her." Tom felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What do you mean, Eleanor?" "The woman in the motel, she was a different woman who also worked at the same motel. Maria Finch faked her death by killing another woman and assuming her identity." Tom grasped the full extent of the deception. The Finch siblings had not only committed the murders, but had also obscured their own identities to deceive the police. They had hidden within their roles, just as the gardeners had concealed their faces behind straw hats. Tom stormed out of the office. He had to re-examine the chapel. He had to see the symbol of hope one more time. Inside the chapel, he found a small diary on the altar instead of the map. It was Maria Finch's diary. On the first page, written in a neat hand, it read, "We are the gardeners. We are the seeds the gardener planted, and we will bury the hope that grows in people's hearts." Tom felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The Finch siblings were not just murderers. They were a cult, manipulated and led by Weaver, and they were far from finished with their harvest. The seventh sin, envy, was yet to be fulfilled, and Tom was their next target. Tom sat in the deserted office, surrounded by files and photos. He stared at Maria Finch's diary. The pages were filled with distorted, flower-like drawings and the names of the victims, each marked with a sin. It wasn't a diary, it was a manifesto of hatred and envy. He now knew that Weaver was not the killer, but the ideological head behind the deeds. Dennis and Maria Finch were the hands that executed his vision. They were the seeds that grew in his sick garden. But the most important question was still unanswered. Where were they now? And why the deception about Maria's death? Tom called Eleanor, who was putting the final puzzle pieces together in the forensics lab. "Eleanor, the woman in the motel who was identified as Maria Finch, who was she really?" "We found out," Eleanor said, her voice sounding tired. "Her name was Lisa Kovic, a prostitute who was seen with Dennis Finch a few times. She had disappeared, and her family hadn't reported it. Finch killed her and assumed her identity to hide." Tom now understood the perversion behind the deeds. The Finch siblings had not only killed, they had also assumed a new identity to remain unrecognized. They had become chameleons, adapting to their environment. At that moment, Tom's phone rang. It was an unknown number. He answered, and a soft female voice spoke. "Detective Miller, the diary fascinated you, didn't it? This isn't the end. Tom knew immediately who it was. Maria Finch. "Where are you, Maria?" he asked. "I'm everywhere, detective," she replied. "I am envy, and I am the sin that grows in your heart. I am the hope you lost when you didn't find the real killer, Jonathan Weaver. You are the last seed, detective, and you will flourish." Tom felt a knot tighten in his stomach. She had him. She knew that Weaver had left him a message. She knew that he was tracking the sins. And she knew that he was the last seed in their garden. He stared at the photos of the Finch siblings, two unassuming, average people who became murderers through the envy in their hearts. They weren't what they seemed. They were gardeners. Tom stormed out of the office. He had to find them before they committed their final sin. He no longer had time for evidence or official orders. He had to dive into their game. He had to find the seed of hatred in his heart and tear it out before it consumed him. Tom was at the end of his rope. Maria Finch's voice, echoing in the phone, had planted a new, malicious seed in his mind, the seed of despair. He knew they were watching him, that they were predicting his next move. The hunt was over. It was now a game, and he was the main character in their bloody fairy tale. He returned home. He stared at his wife and son, who were sitting in the living room watching a movie. He no longer saw them as his family, but as potential victims, as pawns in Weaver's perverse garden world. The envy that Maria Finch had awakened in him was not envy for their plan, but the fear he felt because he couldn't protect them. At that moment, his phone rang again. It was Eleanor. Her voice was no longer worried, but firm. "Tom, I found Dennis Finch." Tom's heart beat faster. "Where, Eleanor? Where is he?" "He's hiding in a church," Eleanor said. "He pretended to be a gardener and worked there. I went through his file and found the church he's called home in recent months." Tom knew immediately which church it was. It was the church where Weaver's wife and daughter were buried, the church where Weaver had buried hope, the cemetery he had seen on the night of the gardener. Tom grabbed his gun and ran out of the house. He drove to the cemetery, but this time he didn't drive like a hunter, but like a man walking into a trap. He knew he was walking right into the arms of Dennis and Maria Finch. He knew he embodied the seventh sin, envy, and he knew he was ready to blossom. He parked his car in front of the church. The night was cold and quiet. The church was lit, but the light was unnatural, ghostly. He stepped inside, his gun in his hand. The church was empty, but on the altar lay a map of Bridgeport, the map Weaver had left for him. Tom looked at the map. The empty field was no longer empty. It was marked with a photo of his wife and son. The final sin, envy, was not himself. It was his family. They were the hope Weaver wanted to bury. A voice echoed from the shadows of the church. "Detective Miller, we've been waiting for you." It was Dennis Finch. He stepped out of the shadows, his eyes empty, his hands dirty. He held a pair of pruning shears. "We envied your family, detective," he said in a quiet, cold voice. "Your wife, who loved you, your son, whom you protected. We envied all of that. And now, we're going to take it from you." Tom pointed his gun at Dennis Finch. He knew he had a choice, to shoot him. But he also knew that by doing so, he would bury the hope that Eleanor had seen in him. "This is the end, detective," Dennis said. "The final sin. Envy." He raised the pruning shears. Tom knew he had to shoot, but he hesitated. He saw in Dennis Finch's eyes not a murderer, but a man who had been manipulated by a perverse plan. At that moment, a loud shot rang out. Dennis Finch staggered back, a red flower sprouting from his chest. He looked at Tom, his eyes wide open, but not with madness, but with fear. He fell to the ground. Tom looked toward the door. Eleanor stood there, gun in hand. She hadn't just saved his hope. She had saved him. She had saved him from his own sin, his own envy. The police stormed the church. Dennis Finch was dead, but there was no trace of Maria Finch, the true gardener, the leader of the cult. Tom knelt before Dennis Finch. He looked into his eyes and saw not a murderer, but a man who had been manipulated and destroyed by Weaver. He hadn't committed the murders out of hatred, but out of despair, out of envy. The story had found an end, but the real story had just begun. The search for Maria Finch, the last gardener, who was still waiting somewhere in the city to harvest her final crop, had just begun. And Tom, the detective, who was now driven not by envy, but by revenge, was ready for the hunt.